All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 15, the Civil War, 1860 to 1865. We'll be looking at Section 1, the origins and outbreak of the Civil War. So let's just recall Chapter 14 was all about the 1850s, and there were a series of events really that brought the conflict between the North and the South, the free states and the slave states, kind of to the front page, if you will. And some of those involved what happened in Kansas, for example. The case of Dred Scott was covered in that chapter, the actions of John Brown, and all of these plus more had led to an even bigger conflict between North and South. Really the culmination of all those events was the election of 1860, where you had Abraham Lincoln, who was running as a Republican, which was the party of the North, who won that election. And once Abraham Lincoln won the election of 1860 with less than 50% of the popular vote, South Carolina became the first state to secede. And to secede means to leave the Union. So South Carolina in 1860 became the first state to officially leave the Union. It was joined by 6 other states to make a grand total of 7. So 7 states leave the Union upon Abraham Lincoln's election. Now, if we look back at the causes of the Civil War itself, yes, the 1850s were kind of a very important decade, probably the most important decade in all of American history, to be honest. But the causes of the Civil War really stretch back much further. And if we were to pinpoint it on one particular issue, it was this issue of the expansion of slavery, specifically slavery in the West. Because you have to think that both northern and southern states, the free states and slave states, existed at the nation's birth, following the American Revolution and the creation of the Constitution. Southern states legalized slavery, northern states moved to gradually abolish it. Most of the time, states sort of respected and recognized that difference. However, the problem really arose when it came to new states, specifically in the West. And so all of these things were covered in previous chapters, but you see the fight over new states, and the fight is whether or not slavery should be legal in them, happened in Missouri in the 1820s, happens in Texas in the 1840s. The Mexican Cession, which was territory that was won by the United States from the Mexican-American War, also in the 1840s. And along these debates, right, so throughout these debates over Missouri, over Texas, over the Mexican Cession, which included California, a new idea emerged as a potential solution to this problem. That was popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty stated, let the people of a territory / state vote on the legality of slavery. And this was a potential solution because when it came to Missouri, when it came to Texas, when it came to the Mexican Cession, which was essentially California, the free states and the slave states couldn't agree as to whether or not slavery should be legal in those territories. Popular sovereignty was the solution to that problem. Simply just let the people vote, and as long as Congress is willing to recognize the outcome of that vote, this is a potential solution. However, popular sovereignty was practiced in Kansas, and the result was bleeding Kansas, which was the violence in Kansas in the 1850s. Essentially, it was left up to a vote in Kansas. Pro-slavery forces moved to Kansas, voting for the pro-slavery position. Anti-slavery forces moved to Kansas, voting for the anti-slavery position, and they essentially killed each other. This was occurring 10 years before the Civil War, in the mid-1850s, sometimes called the Civil War before the Civil War. So it turned out that popular sovereignty, which was potentially seen as a good solution, doesn't really work out in practice, and Kansas is evidence of that. You also had a growing voice regarding the anti-slavery position. We talked previously about the abolitionists and how they came to oppose slavery based off religious and kind of American principled reasons or enlightened reasons. The Liberty Party was an abolitionist political party. Both the Free Soil Party and the Republican parties were created as anti-slavery parties. And that was because the predominant political parties at the time, the Whigs and the Democrats, didn't take a strong stance. And so you had the creation of, even just 3 political parties here. The Republican Party being the party that Lincoln belongs to and becomes elected in 1860, that are just solely dedicated to this position of anti-slavery. So this issue of slavery expanding into the Western territories is becoming increasingly the most important issue in the country. Now, upon South Carolina's departure from the Union, one last-ditch effort was made in order to try and prevent the breaking up of the Union, and that was the Crittenden Compromise, which proposed to extend the Missouri Compromise line. And you actually see it in this image here. So in an effort to try and keep the country together, stop it from falling apart, the Missouri Compromise line, which had only stretched to here, right, in its original formation, because of course this territory had belonged to Mexico prior to the Mexican-American War. But now that all of this belonged to the United States, especially after the year 1848, all this belonged to the U.S., Crittenden said, well, let's just stretch this line over here. Everything below here will be slave. Everything above here would be free. The Crittenden Compromise, although it was the last effort, we might call this the last effort to prevent breakup, we'll call it that. It was soundly rejected by both Northerners and Southerners that, the issue was too far gone for any type of compromise to be made. And so those 7 states that seceded from the Union, the 7 deep South states, and I think we have an image of, let's see, so we got South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. Let's see, how many is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Which one am I missing? South Carolina, Georgia, Florida. Florida is the last one. So those were the 7 states to secede the Union upon Abraham Lincoln being elected president. South Carolina was the first one. They met and formed a new government, the Confederate States of America, which created a constitution that looked very similar to that of the U.S. Constitution, including 3 branches of government. But one key difference about the Confederate Constitution was a guaranteed protection of slavery. It also was a strong emphasis on states' rights, as, of course, a confederation is a much looser form of government than the system of federalism that the United States had at that particular time. So protections for slavery, protections of states' rights, but more or less the Confederate Constitution was very much similar to that of the United States. Jefferson Davis was named the president of the Confederacy. Alexander Stephens from Georgia was named the vice president. Unlike the U.S. president, the president in the Confederate States of America served for 6 years rather than 4 years. So that is just one sort of slight difference that you had between the two. And this is all occurring before Lincoln is inaugurated. So, of course, typically presidential elections happen in November, but presidents don't actually take the job until January or February. And so by the time that that's happened, that's when the 7 states has left. And so Lincoln is coming into office, essentially first day on the job, with this secession crisis. What does he do about those 7 states that have left the Union? And in his inauguration address in 1861, he says about slavery that he has no intention of abolishing slavery where it exists, but would not allow the spread of it. This is essentially a plea. Will not allow the spread of it. This is a plea to the country. You know, it's obviously the country's breaking apart, and so Lincoln is really trying to plead with the nation to stay together. He has no intention of abolishing it where it exists. However, he says that secession is not constitutional. So about the constitutionality of secession is not constitutional. In other words, South Carolina has no legal right to secede from the Union. And in fact, during the entire Civil War, Abraham Lincoln refuses to acknowledge secession. He instead states that the southern states are in rebellion. They're still part of the country. They're simply in rebellion. Now, even though these states were breaking away, the war had not yet started. Fort Sumter is the beginning of the Civil War. This is also considered to be the first shots fired in Civil War. Fort Sumter was a base in Charleston, South Carolina. The first shots were fired in 1861. Essentially what you had was a harbor. We'll draw little waves. This is supposed to be water right here. And Fort Sumter was a fort out in the middle of the harbor. Now, typically what had happened was when southern states seceded from the Union, federal bases, so this is federal, this would be the state right here. This is supposed to be land. This is supposed to be Charleston Harbor. Federal territory in southern states got passed over to state governments. When South Carolina demanded that Fort Sumter, a federal fort, be turned over to the state, the general there refused to turn it over. And after about a standoff of a couple days or even a couple of weeks or so, the South Carolina militia opened fire on Fort Sumter, which is the illustration that you see here. And this was considered to be the start or the first shots fired in the Civil War. After Fort Sumter happened, a lot of the states and a lot of individuals who had been kind of on the fence about whether or not to join secession made their decision. After Fort Sumter, the Upper South, places like Virginia, decided to go for the Confederacy. So following the original 7 states, so we'll go ahead and maybe we'll use a different color here to mark. So you had the original, well, maybe not green, but you had the original 7 states here, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Florida, South Carolina, that had seceded from the Union after the firing upon Fort Sumter. Purple's not a good color either because purple's already in there. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas also decided to secede as well. So that's what we call the Upper South. In Virginia, you had something unique. Part of Virginia went to the south, but part of Virginia also broke away. And so this created a new state in the form of West Virginia, which fought for the Union. So in addition for states having to decide whether or not to go Union or Confederacy, North or South, to secede or to stay, individuals also had to choose. Robert E. Lee was one of the most accomplished generals who had the best, resume or accolades. Robert E. Lee was offered by President Lincoln to fight for the North. However, his home state of Virginia seceded in the South. And so his decision was fight for your country or fight for your state. Robert E. Lee eventually decided to fight for the South and for his home state rather than for his home country. But many Americans, thousands of Americans, had to make this decision. And especially in states like Virginia, Tennessee, Maryland, even to a certain extent up here, you might have half the population deciding for the Union, half the population deciding for the Confederacy. Now, there are some also, we have here our Confederate states, right, that are filled in. But there also are some important states that we want to make note of. And these are either border states or slave states that fought for the Union. So in the states of Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky, in all of these states, slavery is legal, but they fight for the North. Right? The border states are the states in which slavery is legal, but they end up fighting for the North or for the Union.